In the autumn of 1882, in the Colorado Territory settlement of Harlan's Gap, a young woman named Alara Whitfield was accused of something she did not do and was abandoned by the person who should have protected her most. The accusation came from her stepmother, Cordelia Whitfield, a sharp-featured woman who had married Alara's father, Tobias, just 2 years before and had never hidden her contempt for the daughter her marriage had acquired. The problem was a string of livestock deaths. Over the course of that summer and early fall, Tobias Whitfield's cattle and horses had begun to sicken and die. First, a prize milk cow fell suddenly ill and never recovered. Then 2 horses went lame and had to be shot. Then a pregnant mare miscarried her foal and died from infection. By late September, 8 animals were dead, and Tobias stood to lose a significant portion of his wealth and stability. Cordelia examined the evidence with the eye of someone practiced in finding fault and determined that the deaths had been caused by poison. Not accidental poisoning from plants or spoiled grain, but deliberate poisoning. She examined Alara's hands for stains. She questioned the other settlement members about whether they had seen her daughter behaving strangely. She suggested, in whispers that were calculated to spread, that perhaps the young woman was angry about the marriage. Perhaps she was jealous of the attention Tobias showed his new wife. Perhaps she had decided to punish them both by destroying the livestock that represented their wealth. The theory was absurd. Alara was a sensible girl who had supported her father's marriage and treated Cordelia with the respect a dutiful daughter owed to a stepmother. But the frontier thrives on gossip and blame, and when misfortune strikes, people are hungry to explain it through human malice rather than through randomness and chance. Slowly, the narrative that Cordelia had created began to spread through Harlan's Gap. People who passed by the Whitfield homestead began to regard Alara with suspicion. When she came to the trading post, conversations would falter. When she attended church, mothers would move their children slightly away from her bench. She became the girl who poisoned her father's livestock out of jealousy and spite. Tobias, weak-willed and desperate to maintain his standing in the community and his new marriage, did not defend his daughter. He said nothing when the accusations reached his ears. He made no public statement that he believed in her innocence. He simply fell silent, and his silence was acceptance. Cordelia pressed her advantage. She began to speak openly of the danger that Alara represented to the household. She suggested that perhaps the girl should leave, should find employment elsewhere, should remove herself from the property where she had been born. She was not explicitly cast out. Rather, the situation was arranged so that staying became impossible. There was no food set out for Alara at mealtimes. Her room, which she had always kept tidy, had water poured through the roof so that her blankets were ruined and the walls grew mold. When Alara tried to repair the damage, Cordelia claimed that she was being destructive and wasteful. Messages from her father became increasingly cold and impersonal. By late October of 1882, with the first snows beginning to fall and winter approaching, it became clear that Alara had 3 choices. She could leave the settlement entirely and attempt to survive in the wilderness alone. She could stay and continue to suffer until Cordelia found a way to have her formally removed and possibly arrested. Or she could die. At 18 years old, possessing only the skills her frontier childhood had given her, Alara chose the first option. She took what little she could carry: a heavy wool dress, a shawl, a blanket, and a small iron key that had belonged to her mother, and she left her father's house on a cold morning in late October. Nobody came to stop her. Nobody came to bring her back. Her father, who had once loved her, chose his new wife over his only daughter. She walked north toward the ridge above the settlement, a place where Alara knew from her explorations that there were caves carved into the limestone. She knew it was not a perfect shelter. The caves were not deep, not naturally insulated, not designed for human habitation. But they existed, they were available, and they were better than dying in the wilderness or accepting Cordelia's cruelty. She walked toward those caves as though they were destiny rather than desperation, and she began the work that would transform her from a cast-off daughter into a woman whose name would be spoken with respect and gratitude in Harlan's Gap for generations. The cave she selected was shallow, perhaps 20 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with a high ceiling that sloped gently back into darkness. There was a natural fissure in the rock that rose toward the surface, the remnant of ancient water flow that would serve as a chimney. The entrance faced south and east, which would catch what little winter sun existed in the Colorado Territory. But it was cold and damp, and the stone walls seemed to breathe moisture even in dry weather. On her first night in the cave, Alara did not sleep. She sat wrapped in her single blanket while the temperature dropped and the darkness deepened, and she thought about what would need to happen if she was going to survive. She had no tools. She had no money. She had no support from the town. What she had was time before winter became absolutely lethal, and she had a mind that understood the problem logically rather than emotionally. The problem was heat loss. The cave was insulated somewhat by the surrounding stone, but stone alone was not sufficient. Heat radiated through stone. Wind found cracks and gaps. Air moved, carrying warmth away, replacing it with cold. She needed insulation. She needed something between the stone walls and the interior space that would trap heat and prevent it from radiating away. She needed something that was cheap or free, that was available on the frontier, and that could be transported and positioned by a young woman working alone. She needed hay. In the morning, she began to walk the ridge and the meadows beyond it, searching. She found an abandoned homestead 3 miles north of the cave, a place where someone had attempted to create a ranch and then given up, leaving behind a barn still partially filled with stored hay. Hay that had been there for years, out-dried to brittleness, but still structurally sound. Over the course of October and November, Alara made countless trips carrying armloads of hay back to the cave. She had no cart, no horse, so she carried it on her back, bundled in her shawl, making 3-mile journeys repeatedly over rocky terrain. Her hands blistered and bled. Her feet developed calluses. Her body grew stronger from the labor, but also thinner as she foraged for food. Berries, small game she could trap with cordage, roots that could be boiled. The work was beyond what most people could endure. Each bundle of hay weighed 30 pounds. Each journey took 2 hours in good weather and 4 in snow. She made sometimes 3 trips a day, returning to the cave as darkness fell, collapsing into her thin blanket with muscles screaming and hands lacerated. Yet she continued. The alternative was death, and she had not walked away from her home and father to simply perish in a different location. She had walked away to live. Henry Ashworth, the old trapper who lived on the ridge, found her on a freezing day in late October, collapsed in the snow with an armload of hay still clutched to her chest. He brought her to his cabin, fed her warm stew, and asked her what she was doing. When she explained, he did not try to dissuade her. He simply began to help. He arrived with his own horse and cart. He brought her additional hay from sources he knew. He brought her tools, a hatchet, a knife, nails, rope, wooden beams for support structure. He never asked for explanation or gratitude. He seemed to understand that this young woman had determined to survive through effort and intelligence, and that it would be an insult to pity her or to make survival contingent on her accepting his charity in a submissive way. He treated her as an equal partner in a project, and his respect became a form of encouragement more powerful than words could convey. Nathaniel Cross, a skilled carpenter and builder who lived on the settlement side of the ridge, came to the cave in November. He had heard through the village that Alara Whitfield had not frozen to death as everyone seemed to hope, but was instead doing something strange and purposeful on the ridge. His curiosity brought him to the cave entrance, where he found Alara lining the walls with thick bundles of tightly packed hay, creating a wall of insulation between the stone and the interior space. He examined her work in silence for a long time, then asked her what she was attempting. When she explained the principle of insulation and heat retention, when she showed him her calculations about how much heat the cave would lose through the stone with different insulation thicknesses, Nathaniel recognized something that most people would have missed, that this young woman understood engineering intuitively and was applying it under desperate conditions. He was impressed not merely by her effort, but by the intelligence behind it. He began to come to the cave regularly, sometimes with additional materials, sometimes simply to work alongside her. Together, they built a door from scrap wood, hung on leather hinges, that sealed the entrance without blocking the chimney vent. They built a clay and stone fireplace at the back of the cave, carefully positioned so that the smoke would rise toward the natural chimney crack and vent outward without creating dangerous backdrafts inside the shelter. They tested the system repeatedly, refining it until the smoke flowed correctly and the heat distributed through the space evenly. They discussed air pressure and convection, the movement of heat, the principles of thermodynamics, though neither of them had formal education in such matters. They understood these principles through the practical necessity of making them work. By December 1882, Alara had transformed the shallow cave into something that defied logic. Every surface was lined with hay, walls, ceiling, even the floor was covered with a thick layer of dried grass, creating insulation beneath the packed earth. She had installed a functioning fireplace that could be fueled with wood and stone gathered from the ridge. She had created a door that sealed against wind and cold. She had a crude but effective shelter. And then, over the course of December and into January 1883, something remarkable happened. The cave became warm, not hot, not comfortable by the standards of a cabin with a large hearth, but genuinely warm. The thick hay insulation had created an airtight space, and the small fireplace, even when burning modestly to conserve fuel, was sufficient to maintain a temperature of 45 to 55 degrees inside the cave, even when the outside temperature plummeted toward lethal extremes. Alara tested it obsessively, checking the temperature with a thermometer that Henry had given her, making notes about how much wood was required, and how long different fires would burn, how to arrange the hay to maximize insulation without blocking airflow. She was collecting data about her own survival, and the data confirmed that what she had built actually worked. By January 1883, the winter had become serious. The temperature in Harlan's Gap dropped regularly to -15 degrees. The cabins in town, poorly insulated and heated by fireplaces that lost more heat than they generated, became colder inside than out during particularly brutal nights. The townspeople huddled together and burned wood at a rate that would leave them with insufficient fuel by March. The animals suffered. The vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, the very young began to sicken. And then, in late January, a boy died. He was 5 years old, the son of a merchant, and he died of pneumonia complicated by the constant cold that his parents could not prevent in their home. His small body was kept on a shelf in an unheated storage room because the ground was too frozen to dig a grave. The town was shocked. The frontier had always been dangerous, but dead children felt like an admission that the settlements were not yet civilized or safe. People began to talk about leaving, about giving up on the Colorado Territory, and returning to places where winter could be survived without tragedy. And it was at this moment, when the town was despairing of its own survival, that word began to spread about a young woman living on the ridge in a cave that was inexplicably warm. The story was treated as a curiosity at first, then as a legend, that Alara Whitfield, cast out by her father, had somehow created a shelter that defied the logic of frontier living. Nathaniel Cross, who could not deny what he had seen with his own eyes, began to speak about the insulation principle, about the hay, about the engineering that he and Alara had designed together. People came to see the cave. They climbed the ridge despite the brutal cold and stood in the entrance, feeling the warmth radiating outward, seeing the thick golden hay lining every surface, witnessing the functioning fireplace, understanding that this young woman had done something that seemed impossible. When Mayor Pritchard of Harlan's Gap came to the cave in February 1883, he brought a proposal. Alara's cave was maintaining 50 degrees even when the outside temperature reached -35. It was holding families of people safely during the night. The town wanted her permission to shelter people there. They wanted to send the sick and vulnerable, children, the elderly, the pregnant women, to the cave where they could survive the cold. Alara agreed without negotiation or demand for payment. What followed was one of the most remarkable periods in the history of Harlan's Gap. Through February and into early March, while the brutal cold continued, Alara's cave became a sanctuary. She allowed families to rotate through, spending their nights in the warm stone chamber lined with hay, returning to their homes by day. She showed people how the insulation worked. She taught them that the principle of hay lining could be replicated in their cabins, using the same materials and the same logic. She never charged anyone. She never asked for anything in return. She simply welcomed them into the shelter that she had created through labor and intelligence. When the weather finally broke in mid-March and the temperature began to rise toward survivable levels, the town had a choice to make about how to treat the young woman who had saved them. Mayor Pritchard called a town meeting, and he stood before Harlan's Gap and told them the true story of Alara Whitfield. Not the story that Cordelia had fabricated about livestock poisoning and jealousy, but the actual story of abandonment and survival. He spoke about her refusal to accept defeat or despair. He spoke about the intellectual courage required to understand that the solution to a problem lay in materials everyone had access to, but nobody had thought to use. And he declared that Alara Whitfield should be granted whatever support the town could offer: a plot of land to expand her shelter, supplies for the coming year, recognition as the person who had prevented the settlement from becoming another failed homestead erased from history. The vote was unanimous. Everyone in Harlan's Gap, including the families whose sick children and elderly parents she had saved, affirmed that Alara had earned their gratitude and respect. The only person who did not attend the town meeting was her father, Tobias. He had finally found the courage to stand against Cordelia's cruelty, but it had come too late to do anything but acknowledge his failure as a parent. He came to the cave on a cold evening in April, when the worst of the winter had passed, but the meadows were still recovering from the deep freeze. He looked at his daughter, now stronger and more capable than he had ever been, standing in a shelter she had created through her own will and intelligence. Her hands, once soft and untrained, were now capable and scarred from months of labor. Her face, once marked by uncertainty and vulnerability, was now inscribed with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the absolute worst the world had to offer and had refused to surrender to despair. He tried to speak several times, searching for words that could somehow make amends for his abandonment, for his weakness, for his choice to believe his wife's cruelty instead of his daughter's character. Finally, he said only, I should have believed in you. Alara looked at her father, this broken man who had chosen his wife over his daughter when it mattered most. And she chose something different than blame or bitterness or righteous anger. She chose grace. She said, "Come in where it's warm." And she led him into the shelter that was always warm, that she had built with hay and stone, and the absolute refusal to accept that she deserved less than survival. The winter had whispered its lessons to Alara, and she had listened well. It had taught her that the most important things cannot be inherited. They must be earned through effort and sacrifice. It had taught her that love from others is unreliable and conditional, but self-reliance is absolute and permanent. It had taught her that when the world tells you that you are worthless and should disappear, that you deserve nothing and should expect nothing, the only response is to create something so valuable that the world cannot help but recognize it. Preparation is not fear. It is not paranoia or obsession. It is the quiet language of those who have learned to listen when the winter whispers. It is the voice of survival speaking to those patient enough to hear. Subscribe to Winter Whispers for more stories of frontier wisdom and quiet survival.